Welcome to Psych 319, Chapter 10, Part 2. So there is some hard evidence to support the use of visual imagery in cognition, and some of this comes from the rotation studies. You will be doing a mental rotation lab this week, so you'll get to experience this for yourself. You might want to try that first before seeing the sneak peek answer here, because otherwise it'll be really, really boring. But here we have three different figures, and they're projected onto the screen in various orientations, and you might be asked whether whether the pair in A is the same, or the pair in B is the same, or the pair in C is the same. In order to do that, you need to mentally rotate one of the objects to see if they align and see whether they're the same object, because they're quite similar. Well, the result is interesting. The amount of time it took to mentally rotate an object is similar to the amount of time it takes to physically rotate the object. It's not exactly the same, but the order is the same. So, for example, if there was more rotation in C compared to B compared to A, then C would also take you a longer time to make a mental decision about that. A similar idea was done with this map study from Coslin, and subjects were given a bunch of tasks to do with this map. Maybe they were asked, well, which would take you longer? Would it take you longer to get water from the well, go pick an apple from the tree, go to the hut, and go to the grasslands? Or would it take you longer to go from the grasslands to the northmost point of the island, back down to the lake, etc., etc.? And so they're given a task, and then the subjects would make a response on that. And it turned out that the amount of time it took them to mentally calculate a particular distance was also correlated with the actual physical distance. So that sort of leads one to believe that the mental picture was necessary for them in order to solve the task. So the good news, these two studies are very robust, and they've been replicated in many ways. So there is strong evidence that changing the physical stimulus or the task is correlated with changing the behavior, and that visual imagery is involved in solving these problems. So yeah, anyway, that's just what I said. The bad news. Now, I want you to do this little mental experiment. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think of yourself walking across the room and sort of make a note of when you reach the other end of the room. And after you've done something like that, I want you to compare that time to, now I normally do this in a classroom, so I use the cafeteria as example, but think of how long it would take you to go outside and cross the street. And then you can do the same thing, walking all the way to Manhattan, or if you're in Manhattan, walking from the top of Manhattan to the bottom. And what you might experience is that you can actually mentally get someplace far faster than you could ever walk there. When I do this in a classroom, people raise their hand at very, very different times, but it's usually much shorter than it would take for them to complete the actual task. And what that tells us is that we're speeding up time in our minds, right? So at some point, our representation of space and time becomes non-linear. It's not a linear representation, not a one-to-one representation between the physical world and our mental world. And that's pretty intuitive. I think you would have guessed that. It's not a surprise. But we're actually really bad at time perception. Just ask a friend, don't let them have any access to a clock, and ask them to raise their hand when they think a minute has passed. If you try this in a group, you'll see that everybody's hands go up at a very, very different time. Because we don't have an internal clock, and we don't have an internal measure of space. So we're using visual imagery, but it's not an exact, reliable image. Some more problems with this. Just like people confabulate when they reconstruct memories. Remember, confabulation is the idea of changing the order or the information in a memory so that it makes more sense, that it completes a storyline, or it is acting in accordance to a schema that you have about the way the world works. So people also tend to reorganize visual information according to schemas. So I can ask you this question: which is further west, Reno, Nevada, or San Diego, California? Um, and a lot of people get this wrong. The actual answer is Reno, Nevada. And what happens is most people uh, actually do not use a visual representation. If they were using a visual representation to solve this task, they would get it right because they could see that Reno is in the westmost corner of Nevada and San Diego is actually pretty far east because California bends. But most people use logic to solve this problem. They reason that California is west of Nevada, and therefore all cities in California must be west of all cities in Nevada, but it's not true at all. So visual imagery can't be the only way that visual information is encoded or retrieved. So how do we represent space in our bodies? There's several types. There's proprioception, which is basic body awareness and balance. And there's egocentric space, the awareness of your position in relation to your immediate surroundings. So this is what keeps you from bumping into stuff. And then there's navigational space, the awareness of your place in the world, including your ability to use maps and navigate to far locations beyond your immediate surroundings. And this is a very important task for us to have as humans. We need the ability to do this, but we also don't do it perfectly. Just ask anybody navigating a new city. They get lost all the time. And so our use of visual imagery is obviously very important, but why isn't it perfect? You can probably imagine every item in your room with perfect accuracy. However, most of us can't make it through the day blindfolded. Again, more examples of this. I'll skip over this because it is pretty much the same thing I just said. So it seems that the brain is kind of a bag of tricks. We tend to use what is best for a particular task in a situation. So visual imagery might be very useful for certain things. Spatial navigation, that's not too far, rotation of objects, and so on and so forth. But there are definitely clear instances where we're not using it, like phonological loops, language, obviously. There's some type of encoding that's going on between vision and auditory systems. That's just what I said. So perhaps maybe the better image is, instead of saying visual imagery, we might say mental imagery. That maybe there is a more basic code that's not just a picture-based code, but something that's more based in spatial relationships, an iconic representation of spatial relationships that you might call mental imagery. And things might be encoded into this space, but in that process there might be some visual information that is lost. So Fink came up with a very long list of how visual imagery should behave if we were using it, and it would use. I'm going to skip to some of the examples because this is all written out for you in the slides. But the idea that the more complicated a visual image is, the more complicated a visual picture is, the more complicated it should be to make a mental image of that picture. So there are all these things that he says, like perceptual equivalence. Images are perceived similar to the real events that inspired them. And that's an example, like mental rotation is a good example of that. And spatial equivalence. Our map study seems to say that it takes just as much mental time, or an equivalent mental time, as it does to travel a distance in a room. There's other ones, transformational equivalence, the idea that if you're going to change something, like imagine putting together a bicycle in your mind and putting together a bicycle in real life, that the more complicated the bicycle, the more complicated the task, or the order, or how it should take you longer to do this in your imagination. And structural equivalence as well. The more complex a particular object is to remember, the more complex it should be. The more complex it is physically, the more complex it should be able to be in order to make a mental representation of it. But sometimes in these two cases here, there are some exceptions that seem to break this rule. So for example, in transformational equivalence, we can imagine things that break the rules. We can imagine things that don't exist, like a flying pig. Now, a flying pig should be incredibly complicated, and a transformation that takes a really long time relative to a standing pig, but then it doesn't. We're very imaginative, and we can create scenarios that don't exist. So we seem to break the laws of physics in our mind, and so Fink's theory sort of falls apart when you think about examples like that. And we also, as we've seen, we tend to simplify things very, very greatly. So structural equivalence, the idea that more complicated things should take longer to encode, well, not if we leave out all the details. And that's something we tend to do. So there's a long list of these critiques about mental imagery. And again, I'm just going to leave those up in the slide. I've talked a little bit about them. And I just want to allude finally to the fact that it seems that there is no one theory here that seems to be correct. So the final idea is the propositional theory, the idea that we don't use an exact visual image, but we're using icons or place marks to remember things in their spatial representations. So when you have a map, a mental map of your living room, it's not a detailed map, but it has particular things in it that work as landmarks. Maybe that's why it's so easy to get around a strange city if you have really good landmarks like Statue of Liberty or a giant tower or something like that, because you can create a mental picture, a place mark of that. Forget about all the details, and then use that as a way of navigating through space. So it might look as though we're using a visual picture to navigate through the environment or do some type of experiment. We might be using this iconic mental imagery rather than the visual imagery. How do you test this? Very difficult to do. So Coslin developed an experiment that was clever where she tested the associative strength between features that prime each other and found that features that were more related tend to prime each other better than features that were things that were unrelated, based on the associative strength, not the visual association. So baseballs are white, so you think, according to visual imagery, that if a baseball was white, you might make a priming association between that. But it turns out that we're better for things like baseball and bat, because baseball and bat occur more frequently in language, and the auditory code appears to work faster than that visual code. So again, it seems like this is an associative strength between things rather than a visual picture or a picture of visual features. So more strong arguments for the mental map as opposed to the visual map. And then when you go into the MRI scanner, it doesn't really argue for one case or the other, but what you find is that visual parts, when you ask people to do a mental task involving visual images, visual cortex lights up. But when you ask them to think of things that are abstract, that can't be visualized easily, then auditory cortex lights up. And that's interesting. So it does seem like there is a little bit more physiological evidence for a non-visual code, or the idea that we're using visual for visual tasks and auditory for other tasks. So does it prove that there is visual imagery? Not necessarily. Visual cortex could light up for visual icons, place marks, or representations of where things are. And auditory cortex should light up for echoes. But, oh, sorry, that's my timer, so I'm running out of time here. But it is evidence that maybe there is. So I guess the jury is a little bit out on this one. What's the big picture? I know it's very confusing up to this point. The debate is unresolved. And there's still a lot of arguments about what to do and how to treat this. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the idea of approaching visual imagery is saying that we represent all things as visual imageries is antiquated. We know now that we have memory codes and icons and ways of representing mental pictures that are not, or visual images that are not picture representations, that they're more abstract. So it's most likely that we have a cartoon-like representation of the world that's mostly spatial or visual based, but not literal. And when when it needs to, it can represent things quite visually, but it doesn't it's known that we can't represent all levels of detail. That's for sure. So those are definites. Um, and it tends to only represent things that are behaviorally relevant. That's where landmarks come into play, right? So if a landmark is a great way of navigating around a city, then it becomes useful, but you don't need to know all the writing on the building that you're using as a landmark. Visual imagery is being investigated less now. The more scientists are looking at neuronal representations of the visual world. We're sort of getting into this idea of icons and so on and so forth. So not the clearest story in the world, but I hope you can get some more details um, about these theories from the text and look at some of the experiments closely to see how they bear on this debate that seems to be going on in the field, and maybe decide for yourself. Maybe you're the person who's going to untangle all of this information. So again, thank you, and I will see you in the next chapter.